Poštovanje svima, slijedi uvodna.
Good afternoon. Here is the introductory thought of our this evening's interlocutor that we will welcome at the beginning of the season of Izvan Okvira show. Affiliation with the society includes a paradoxal point where each one of us has been ordered to choose what has already been imposed on us. How does freedom and solidarity is understood by ordinary men, and how by the people who have power? How can we get from the margins to the center and impose ourselves as a relevant factor? This is the question of all ordinary people whose voice is not heard in the mainstream. All of these topics are still relevant in the new season of Izvan Okvira because the corona pandemic has been taking a long while, along with the other crises with borders, social organization and values, crisis of democracies from Afghanistan to our Balkans. Do not miss our conversation with the philosopher this evening who challenges new communism since the end of 80s. Slavoj Zizek attracted attention as a columnist of Alternative Youth magazine, which included criticism of Tito's regime, criticizing of several aspects of Yugoslav politics, especially militarization of the society. Zizek was a member of the Communist Party of Slovenia until 1988, when he left it due to disagreements with the Ljubljana process against 4 journalists who were accused of publishing a military secret together with 32 more Slovenian intellectuals. This thinker, whose viewpoints about civilization and society provoke both leftists and rightists, has become inspiration for youth all around the world. He has 2 PhDs and is a global star. The followers of this philosopher say that Slavoj Zizek is maybe his own worst enemy, but this can also be a part of his philosophical approach. In order to ask us a question about ideology of Zizekism and global capitalism and high and low culture. Stay with us in the next minutes with the N1 program. Due to other obligations of our interlocutor, this evening's show will be a bit shorter. Soon we will welcome the philosopher Slavoj Zizek.
We
are going to Ljubljana now. Mr. Zizek, thank you for agreeing to speak for N1 TV.
Thank you. It is my honor.
While we were discussing about this evening's interview, you told me that you are not really willing to comment on the Balkans and topics that shape this area. So let's start from Afghanistan, because the attention is already slowly dissipating ever since the Taliban took the positions of power. The developments in the past few weeks have imposed a series of questions. Let me ask you, how do you interpret the events in Afghanistan, where the democratic facade of Kabul has fallen apart like a house of cards?
I will try to be a bit provocative. Democratic facade has fallen apart. When we say it, first of all, I do not think that this was simply a facade imposed by the American occupation. Of course, this is something special, but as we may see now with the protest of Afghanistan women, etc., one of course, unplanned consequences of the American occupation is still a birth of civilian society, female organizations, youth, intellectual organizations, etc. And this is perhaps something which is most valuable. Therefore, I cannot accept those even leftists who say, nevertheless, with all the difficulties, the victory of Taliban is the defeat of neo-colonialism, global imperialism, etc. My first counter-argument is here something that was clear even earlier, that imperialism, of course, is something terrible, negative, colonialism, but it only creates place for liberation. We have India nearby. Do not forget that Indian independence was the result of liberals in the Congress Party raised in England, and on the other hand, Taliban's. This is not an authentic old Islam. This is so clear that Taliban, with its organization, even ideology, is something modern, not in means of our global views, but normal in terms of reaction to the Western pressures, etc. I have written about this, maybe someone knows about it, but one of these days, I was reading the articles about Afghanistan up to the communist and Soviet occupation. It was relatively one of the most tolerant Muslim countries with different religions, forms of modernity, women in public life, students, etc. So this should be in our mind. When Americans occupied 20 years ago Afghanistan just to destroy Taliban's, the result of the occupation is that Talibans are more powerful, more than ever.
Mr. Zizek, these days we have been reading about the reasons for the change of regime in Afghanistan. Isn't this argumentation a bit inappropriate that we hear that the Afghanistani people is simply not mature enough for democratization and that they long for some fundamentalism? It is trivial to think?
Absolutely naive and banal. Again, I think that it is not the point that it is not ready. The point is that the current fundamentalism is the result of how Afghanistan just faced the modernization. Paradox is, before the world powers started mingling with Afghanistan, Afghanistan was far less fundamentalistic compared to today. This is something that we should have in mind. Not from this modernization, but what is it that it is not good in our modernization? And I think that here the problem is subjectivity, humanity that is spread nowadays as something modern. This type is in fact a deep but at the same time somehow indifferent pluralism, different identities, ways of enjoying life, etc. Isn't it sad to say, if you look at the American, even some European media, the only passion, the only engagement we have is this politically correct suspicion. Whatever you do, whether you were implicitly racist or whatever, there is no positive project that would, with the old Marxist style, would catch masses, modernism, which we have right now. Yes, I do agree, is not giving results.
3 or more, several decades ago, Habermas said that modernity is an incomplete project.
Yes, I do agree what is positive in modernism, but I would not agree with his style. This is a bit naive project of free communication. This is another issue, but I think that there is right, not only for the sake of Afghanistan, etc., but also for the sake of our personal destiny. We should think, we who are in the so-called modernity, how we live. Now when Americans withdrew, ask someone who is leftist, what Americans should do there. This is so typical. When occupation was in the process, there were no clear lines in terms of we should fight Taliban, how to organize it, etc. And this is so typical for me. But now, when Taliban won, this is so typical. This is a huge concern for the victims, how to help women victims, all those who want to leave the country. This is so sad that only identification which we currently have, that we are capable of, is identification with the victims, how to help victims, etc. There is no positive project for me. This is a huge problem. Why? Because now we are coming close to the situation, therefore I am a bit advocating in a provocative way communism. But when I say communism, I'm not thinking of the 20th century. This is what I mean. This is a horror here with the pandemic. It was so clear. Now with the global economic problems, it is clear. But I'm talking about local catastrophes. I heard from Chile. There they have there are no rains, the whole agriculture is in collapse, but the reason is not in the weather, but a huge cloud deep in the ocean of warm weather. We have catastrophes over there, but it is clear that this is the consequence of some global disturbances. So today, is it not clear with pandemic, with ecology, that we need huge global project, coordination, how to face difficulties? What about these millions who should move from agriculture? We can see what happens. Circulation of nature is disturbed, disrupted. This cannot be perhaps solved, but keep under control at the global level. Please say. Okay.
So if the current world is in crisis, and you said repeatedly that capitalism needs crisis in order to exist, so does the current situation strengthen capitalism? How can we reach an alternative if we have a crisis which strengthens capitalism and makes it relevant?
First of all, I would like to say that, under one, if you look at the capitalism nowadays, this is not the same capitalism as it was 4 or 5 years ago. Capitalism somehow spontaneously understood it better than leftists, that the things change and it offers different new models. Closing of sovereignty, technocratic globalism, digital control, etc. But I think that in long term, I'm pessimist here, I think that this will not go. Capitalism can survive, but the price will be difficult. Even capitalist countries now are getting stronger. State intervention at all levels. I was pleasantly surprised here by Biden, American president, and his interventions. Maybe he will not be successful, but these trillions of dollars for the environment policies, etc. But things happen, but where do we go? There is no guarantee here. I think that the principal danger here is, where communists are still in power, that the principal danger is Chinese model, which combines wild capitalism with strong centralized state. These two things, is it not something that the lefts fear the most? wild competition which destroys everything, and authoritarian state so powerful.
Will the Chinese model become global?
Become?
Global?
It is becoming global in a way. But in what way? Look, what makes me concerned, people say about these ideas, but if not Chinese model, then we could get even a model which is far more dangerous. I keep repeating it, and I do not remember. We are not testing this new model as omnipresent, even more dangerous. The model, which I like to say, not freedom, but complete digital control, regulation, manipulation, but which reflects the appearance of our freedom. I keep reiterating, the biggest danger today is freedom, which conceals not freedom, non-freedom, which we test as freedom in general terms, and we are not aware what could be more free compared to how one Western person lives in liberal world. You buy whatever you want, you spend your money the way you like, you do whatever you feel like, but you are already manipulated. We keep forgetting which is Trechkin, Julian Assange, and this is where I see his key message. When Assange was objected, why do you go against America? China is even having stronger control. I agree with this, but in China and in cultural revolution in other countries, people do not have illusion that they live in freedom. If we start criticizing these authoritarian states, Turkey, Belarus, China, etc., we should start from ourselves. We have to be self-critical. Is what we have the freedom that we look for, freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is always freedom in some frame. And the problem are these frameworks. Let us not forget that two principal figures some decades ago in Margaret Thatcher and Reagan kept saying, let us bring freedom back to individual, and result is society of the full control. This is the problem, and therefore I think, that's why I think that such model of modernity, present ones, individualist, credible, comparative capitalism, cannot be exported to Afghanistan and other countries. Problem is not that we should let these countries go back to their tradition, to their authentic identity. They have lost this identity, and Talibans are just the proof of this lost identity. Taliban is not the authority. This is where the problem lies, and therefore although I absolutely, of course, do not accept here in Europe, because it's easy to talk about Afghanistan. We say that we are against, but we have cynical appearance, which are not so radical, but they are also dangerous here in Europe. Not to talk about my country, Slovenia, this new axis of evil, Poland, Hungary, and Slovenia. Slovenia is trying to be there. This is again a reaction to modernity, and I do not accept this Western European arrogant position. Those are primitive countries. They just need to copy-paste our model. Let us try from self-criticism whether this model is what we look for. I think that some local identities should be accepted. Therefore, this is also the reality of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is the model in pure state. Shall we stay at the level of typical liberal perspective of three national identities and then international pressures from the EU, etc.? They are limited to whether we should somehow control explosions of national identities, what to do, etc. I think this is the catastrophe. So I think that people should be offered even enthusiastic global, again within Bosnia and Herzegovina, moderation, but not only this liberal mantra that we control one another. Therefore, I remember some years ago, when in Republika Srpska there were huge demonstrations against Dodik and his corruption, that at one point there was some exchange of solidarity with Sarajevo.
Yes, these were justice for Dženan and justice for David that took place in parallel in Banja Luka and Sarajevo.
This was sort of light point to me. Now when people tell me, but this is utopia, etc. It could be utopia, but first of all, situation is asking for it. Environment, crisis, etc. This can be sorted only at the level of global organization.
So,
back in 2018, you published a text for Russia Today where you talked about the Bosnian miracle. And even 3 years later, Bosnia and Herzegovina is still on the headlines of the world media. And this whole post-Yugoslav region is always the current topic, especially now with the arrival of the new High Representative, the law banning denial of genocide. And even in Montenegro, the events that were described by the writer Vuk Drašković as Talibanization of the orthodoxy. Mr. Zizek, do you believe that the international community should take a firmer grip over the Western Balkans and its stabilization?
Yes, from hand. But this is painful. We desperately ask for positive project. The way I see it, Western pressure goes only towards controlling, and this is also a negative project, just to prevent catastrophe, disaster. And they say, yes, we have positive project of Western democracy, tolerance, etc. But perhaps, maybe I'm wrong here, but the only example, and therefore I know Albin Kurti in person, and I have good relationship with people around him in Kosovo, but Kosovo could be a model here. This is a movement, I'm not sure about how to pronounce it, but new political group which based and from its base within several years won more than half votes, offering some project with social democratic feminism, new social movements, elements, etc. This should be the model, not that we impose our Western, and then the overall problem, how to overcome nationalism, appears as the problem or authentic national identity, or that we just give in to the pressures of the Western. In this framework, modernization is accepted as the result of this pressure. Again, I think Kosovo could here be the model. A movement, even without support from these Western liberals. Albin Kurti, maybe you will remember, a year ago he was in power for several months, and then this is well-known story. And then Trump just brought him down, Trump administration, because they had some agreement, Vučić, Edi Rama, and this was not in his favor. So this is now my light point. I'm not trying to idealize Albin Kurti. Yes, there are problems, but he is not, as people like to say, that his idea is big Albania. No, I talked to him about this. Great Albania. He keeps repeating, this is the second degree, perhaps, but it's not relevant. It is important what we do now. He managed something so incredible, which could be a model. I told him, okay, don't you have your province, villagers, those living outside Pristina? Is it not a big conflict between traditionalists and these modern movements? And he tells me, women exploded with their feminism in Kosovo. This is almost the basis of his party, and he managed to prevent it.
But Kurti has a problem with the official Belgrade when it comes to stabilization of Kosovo.
Yes.
The official Belgrade obstructs the independence of Kosovo.
Not only, it is much darker, not only Belgrade, implicitly, for example, this could be important for viewers. He indeed, I talked to him with Kurti and asked him, how do you see concretely about your relationship with Serbia? He told me a nice story. He spent 2 years in prison around the year 2000. There were 200 Serb prisoners and 8 Albanians in that prison. There was no conflict with Serb prisoners whatsoever. We were just trying to protect one another. Only police was, that's why. Well, police were beating them. So this is not Serbia per se. This is the problem of a certain political vision in which we shall come to the problem. It is not only Vučić, but also Edi Rama. Therefore, this is interesting. They don't have good relationship between Albania and Kosovo. Even some that Kurti managed to remove from the stage, some strong stream within Kosovo. This is a complex figure, a model of typical American model, how to put it, of coalition of local authoritarian forces. This has collapsed for the time being. If I would believe in God, I would say, please, let's hope not to have something similar in Bosnia and Herzegovina. European community cannot send someone, controller, so to say, who would lecture you, etc. What can we learn from this liberal Europe? I wrote about this. I remember when in early 90s, during the war, with you, I wrote, you are not a psychoanalyst, can't you write an analysis of this pathology, Balkan pathology, etc. And I told them, I'm sorry, from their pathological view, as we deal with the subjects of Balkan, this is so rational. The only pathology was the pathology of Europe, which, due to its interest, was not successful. Just as my colleague Mladen Delar, maybe you know him, formulated some 25 years ago, even in those days, Balkan, first of all Bosnia, has functioned and is still functioning as unconsciously part of liberal Europe, but this does not mean that this is primitive region where European passions are kissing. This is the region where Europe projects its nationalist traumas, unconscious traumas, etc. Europe per se, which would like to civilize Bosnia. Europe on its own has colonized and accepts and perceives this as old area. Another traumatic point, therefore I'm so critical of this Emir Kusturica. I'm not talking about the quality of his work, but in his films I can see the image of Balkan, which is in fact the Balkan, which is ideological construct of Europe. Underground is his most famous movie. What is the image of Balkan there? There is no normal life, there is no economy, people have sex, drink, kill each other, always ecstasis of traumas, etc. He plays on the role of this poor Balkan person in Europe. If you go down to Balkan, in Sarajevo, I was there several years ago, and you can see that people are normal there with their concerns, etc. And not in terms that Europe offers something. If maybe I'm idealist, but again talking about Albin Kurti, this is positive Kosovo project. Without this, this would just go in circle. This is just false from the position of Europe. They have no right to teach us. This is so tragic for Bosnia. If it stays in this position that your superego is Europe, what happens later, or what could Europe say, etc. No. Single and unique opportunity of Kosovo is if something similar would appear in your country, because in Bosnia, just like multinational community could give lecture to Europe, this would be the unique lecture. I cannot judge. Maybe a crisis would provoke it. Therefore, I'm just thinking how possible it is. If you ask me whether I'm optimist or pessimist, let me tell you, it's perhaps stupid formula. For the same reason, I'm pessimist and optimist at the same time. I'm a bit optimist just because of my pessimism. Pessimism lies in the fact that there is no solution, is that things only move on, that we are becoming more civilized, etc. But again, this crisis perhaps can push us to something new. That's why I have these difficulties, as you can imagine. That's why I told you this is ultra provocative. 6-7 years ago, I would vote for Trump at that time. I still argue, I'm not crazy. Trump is a mistake, but without Trump, I don't think we would have such strong Sanders. We would not have so much more. But not to bother viewers, I saw a TV show. It was something about lawyers, American show, and there is so nice alternative scenario. A lawyer, a woman, wakes up in alternative reality. 2 years after Trump's victory, she woke up, but then she saw on television that Hillary Clinton is the president. This was the alternative reality. The result is that in a way that she is feminist, living under Trump, she's trying to organize something, and then there is pressure from Washington that they would lose votes in favor of Trump. But Trump radicalized the left parties, and I don't think that this is over with Trump. Situation is rather dangerous still, just as people experience this cynical, cold, politically correct attitude. I do not criticize this political correctness. From this position of the stupid liberalism that, no, political correctness for me is false radicalization. We cannot control with the true, we cannot compare it with true problems, is gender equality, etc. Let's not talk about it, but I think that in a way I do understand these simple people who are not like Talibans, but the first step is already made in this direction. In terms, they experience Europe as bureaucracy, control, pandemic, and then again as a natural way out. Then don't drown in this Europe, let us try to keep our authentic identity, let us affirm it, etc. I think that at the global level this will not be tolerated anymore.
Mr. Zizek, please stay with us for a little longer.
Fine.
We'll come back after a short break.
Poštovanje, dobrodošli nazad.
Welcome back to the Izvan Okvira show. Our exclusive guest from Ljubljana is the world-known philosopher Slavoj Zizek. Mr. Zizek, in the world where the media really influence the reality perception, where we have the Western European interpretation and Eastern European interpretation on the other side, so where does the true lie? It seems that the true in the old traditional sense is no longer important. It seems that we are in the golden age of relativization, where key functions are occupied by people like the former American President Trump, Janša in Slovenia, or Vučić in Serbia, or even more radical Dodik in Bosnia.
Of course, this is a good, competent question, but first of all, I think, again, I like to turn things around. Don't think that there was more truth some time ago and now not. If we look at 50, 60 years ago, at the time of the Cold War, there were two huge blocks. And everyone had his own true and absorbed facts in that way. What happens now? To say, in this psycholytic term, Jacques Lacan stated, this is second order, symbolic pact without which there is no democracy. Democracy is not, we have our identities. Democracy is plurality, but in a framework of the basic values, which we should all accept. Now, this basic social pact is collapsing. Who does not care? In United States, this is no longer the old Democrats, Republicans who accepted some basic values. No. Now we have the conflict on a more radical level. There is no reconciliation here. One needs to win or everything should collapse. If Trump wins, everything would collapse. So it means, I repeat, even in theory, one society, this is not explicit laws, etc. I was always fascinated. A society keeps a network of unwritten rules in one place. You know how to accept something, that something should be interpreted literally, etc. But this is falling apart, this symbolism, and this is the worst for me in this pandemic. That's why I understand people who are against lockdown and all these measures. We are not abstract people. To be human being means this is daily routine, socialization, freedom, etc. And this is falling apart. So I don't think that there is no go back to this old normal time where we were together as people, as human beings. We shall lose as everything that we understood as normal.
But there is the impression that the leftist and the rightist share this lack of trust to public government, police bans, public and health control. And this is where the liberal leftists and populist rightists meet. They despise the legislation that support pharmaceutical and medical corporations. Both of them want to resist this pressure. They want to keep the freedom they are used to. And as you say, we are now in the age of post-human era.
Yes, I think, and this is the tragedy. It is not the pandemic. God knows what will happen to us with this environmental crisis, but we will need more of such regulations. So I think that our purpose should not be how to keep regulation at distance, but how to regulate regulators, to make regulations transparent, etc. I think that this is the tragedy nowadays. As you said it nicely, if we talk about regulation, we always think of alienated state apparatus. Fine. Well, look at pandemic, but what should we do? Perhaps international cooperation in terms of global regulation. This is the only way out. Let us not talk about environment. So, I know it, this is not popular position, but I do not share this mistrust abuse by states, but state apparatus has proven to be powerless. State is no longer so powerful, regardless of all the control in their hands, but they did not manage to put pandemic under control. Today we test so much all these state authorities.
Should we maybe abandon many common reasons and beliefs and practices that we are used to, that have shaped our lifestyle?
Yes, this is the tragedy. I do not say that this is nice perspective, but this is the most difficult task. As you said nicely, common sense. I'm not thinking in this arrogant way, but common sense in terms of all these hundreds unwritten rules, what to do in case you meet someone. This changes, we shall lose our normality. We should reconstruct our normality, not on a high level, somewhere at the level of philosophical terms, but at the daily life level. And that's why I see people who stick to normality, who oppose to vaccination, etc., as desperate attempt, even those who do not accept this environment crisis as desperate attempt to preserve normality. This is a mega problem for all of us. I would even go a step further. Something that really concerns me now is, this is what I wrote about, that there is a huge dissatisfaction in the public which cannot be translated to traditional political frameworks. Look at Spain. huge civil movement, and then when they are in the government, this was lost somehow. They just became one of the parties. Even in France, this yellow vest, huge protests cannot be coordinated together with politics. I do not say, well, politics should talk about these authentic problems of small people, but the problems are in these authentic protests of small people with utopic dimension. This is the crisis of ours.
And finally, Mr. Zizek, let's talk about what you haven't explicitly mentioned, the conspiracy theories. Are conspiracy theories a logical consequence of the information gap experienced by the public from the side of the institutions of power? Is it a logical consequence that people fill in these gaps with their own content?
Yes, yes, but I would like to say that on one hand, this vacuum in a way is the consequence of surplus information. We do not have only vacuum and gap, we have immoral number of information which we cannot coordinate, etc. So, for me, the problem of conspiracy theory is the problem of narration, narratives. We desperately need to organize our experience in a consistent story. Not as Frederick Johnson called cognitive mapping, some clear image where we are, where we go. And conspiracy theories offer simple response. But as you stated yourself, it is important that let us not simplify things and deviate simply and criticize simple people with irony that they are so stupid, etc. No, we should offer alternative and lessons. Conspiracy theory is, for me, a global capitalism which cannot offer this narrative. This old story about we have formula of liberal capitalist democracy which is the best possible way. No, this is no longer acceptable. The response is not in this intellectual dichotomy, those who believe in conspiracy, but only some new positive projects. We are doomed if we don't have positive projects.
Thank you, Mr. Zizek, for being our guest in N1 TV program in Ivana Okvira show.
Thank you, and it was my pleasure to talk to you from Sarajevo, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, because I think that today Bosnia and Herzegovina in compensated shape is a problem of all of us. So one society which resolved nationalistic conflicts, how to find a way out, and it is up to you to find solutions. You know, we have in Slovenian some type of proverb. If there is a conflict, let's do something, and then we have saying peace in Bosnia. There is no solution for all of us, not only in the Balkans, even in Europe, without peace in Bosnia. Without peace in Bosnia, we shall have far more Le Pens, Orbans, etc. It's not only to be arrogant in my solidarity, but for my personal interest, I wish you find a formula.
Thank you very much, dear viewers, for being with us and for following the N1 program. This was the first Ivana Okvira show in the new season. Goodbye, and I wish you all the best.